Welcome, fellow creatures of the night, to this meeting of the Midnight Culture Club. Here we venture deep into the nocturnal lands of the strange, the morbid, the absurd and the obscure in film, books, TV, fairy tales, urban legends and many other forms of pop culture. We discuss and analyse these texts to explore the fascinating ways they reflect, comment on and critique the world we live in from its darker side. I am Xenia, the overmotivated nerd who's not letting anyone else get a word in tonight, and I declare this meeting of the Midnight Culture Club officially in session. And my lovely bats and cats and kittens, thank you so much for your patience with this slightly delayed, or maybe not delayed, I'll tell you in a second, episode. I am delighted you're all here despite having to wait for a long time for this episode that is full of rabbit holes and for its sequel that will follow soon-ish, because this is our first two-parter. The topic we're talking about in these two episodes just kept mushrooming into a bigger and bigger and bigger situation, and I just went down lots and lots of different rabbit holes into some weird wonderlands where, for a change, it's not the queen ordering the beheading, but there is a lot of beheading going on, and you'll see why. For now, I can tell you that by the time I returned overground, there was simply too much material for one humble episode. So here we are with a double feature about a story, a motif that has haunted European and American literature and popular legend for centuries. First, I've got a bit of housekeeping that is somehow related to the delay in this episode coming out. This podcast is my hobby. It's supposed to be enjoyable and fun and, something that's just a cool thing to do that I enjoy and that you guys enjoy. Now, unfortunately, I realized that the deadlines of, posting every other Friday has built up quite a bit of time pressure, and that sort of led to me not enjoying the researching and the writing and the sound designing on the episodes and all of that good stuff as much as I did at the very beginning. So basically I cannot deal with any sort of pressure, okay? And because of that, I've made an executive decision to scrap the upload schedule and just take as much time as I need for each episode, so it all stays fun and the creativity of this little project doesn't suffer for the sake of performance. That doesn't necessarily mean that there will be fewer episodes, it just means that there will be no regular upload schedule. Episodes might come out a little further apart or a little closer together than the 2 weeks. We'll see how it goes. I also want to do a little bit more kind of off-the-cuff stuff, where maybe I just talk about a movie or a show or whatever without as much research occasionally. Bit of a yap, but we'll see how often that's going to be, but it's just something that I thought would also be fun to do. In short, it means that for you, every episode is going to be a surprise episode. Yay! I will let you know on Instagram when a new episode is out, and I'll probably also tease it a little bit before it comes. And if you're not on Instagram, I just forgot what the thing is called. If you're not on Instagram, make sure you're subscribed to the pod here on Spotify and keep an eye out for the new episodes so you don't miss anything. Unless, of course, you're one of the VIP people, you know who you are, who are personally informed when a new episode is out, and now everyone else can be jealous of them. If you're not a VIP, I'm sorry. It just means that you have social media, or that I don't know you personally. But yeah, I think that's the admin out of the way. That means we can now get to the first part of our little, as you've seen in the title, headless double feature. And, friends, it's going to be a true feast of the dark and the gothic through the ages. There will be stormy nights, beautiful ghostly brides, bloody murder, horrific husbands, and a putrid past haunting what could be a hopeful present. Through all these stories that we'll be talking about in this episode and the next, we trace not a red thread, but a choker necklace that marks the throat of a woman like a deadly omen. Once it is a broad band clasped by diamonds, then it appears as a black velvet necklace with a very unique detail, or a collier of blood red rubies, and most infamously as a green ribbon tied carefully into a bow. If you dare remove the cursed necklace, heads will roll. And I am wearing a choker right now. You can't see it, but I am. And if you take it off, my head might fall off. We'll see. We can see what happens at the end of the episode if I take it off. So this motif, this core story of a woman with a choker that literally keeps her head on, has seen a revival in the last couple of years, mostly thanks to Carmen Maria Machado's short story The Husband Stitch, which is in the collection Her Body and Other Parties. That's been massively popular. You've probably seen it around if you haven't even read it yourself. This is a short story that takes place in a world where every woman is bound by a ribbon on a different part of her body. The protagonist carries her ribbon around her neck, and it is of green velvet, tied into a neat little bow. She is the woman with the necklace, and she is a storyteller. She shapes her own narrative that draws attention to her struggles of existing in an oppressive marriage in an oppressive world. About a year ago, the band The Last Dinner Party released their debut album, and on this album there's a song called Beautiful Boy that lays out the opportunities for heroism and greatness that men have had in our world since we can remember, but that were often closed off to women. This song references Machado's story in a line that goes, "I am held captive by the ribbon round my neck." These are only two examples of contemporary versions of the story of the headless woman with the necklace. In these modern renditions, the story has taken on a feminist message where the ribbon functions as a sign, as a marker of women as a group that is restrained by the way society sees gender. This is only the most recent flower this story has brought forth, and we will talk in today's episode about from where it has sprung, whereas in the second episode we will be discussing these contemporary versions. So today we're doing the background, and next time we're talking about present day examples. So in today's episode, in part 1, I want to trace where this story first sprouted. In which earth, under which circumstances did it take root, and which elements were there from the very first seed and which evolved later? How can this story be understood in its early context? For this, we need to go far back, 2.5 centuries to be precise, to a country that had overthrown its monarchy to build a new, more equal society, and that now fought for its life, standing ankle deep in the blood of its old elite. Before we travel to the beginnings of our tale, here are a few content warnings. This episode deals with topics of violent death through execution, both fictional and historical. In relation to this, there are a few slightly more graphic descriptions of acts of violence, injuries, and dead bodies. Also, throughout the episode, we'll occasionally touch on themes of dubious consent, disrespecting of bodily autonomy, and implications, I'm placing implications, no direct depictions, of necrophilia. None of these points are graphic or detailed. The long literary history of the woman with the fateful necklace, the band, the ribbon, begins more or less, you'll see, with a short story by the American writer Washington Irving, who you might know for his ghost stories like Rip Van Winkle or Sleepy Hollow. But unlike them, this story here does not take place in the misty forests of New England, but in the old world, in Paris. Paris caught in the throes of the French Revolution and the Jacobin reign of terror. The historical backdrop of the French Revolution and the Reign of Terror will be crucial to this episode, so we need to lay a bit of a foundation and talk about them first before we get into the stories themselves. So let's see how this historical period came about according to my high school history book, Schweizer Geschichtsbuch 2, which is actually pretty cool and contains a lot of primary sources and stuff. I'm glad I kept it. It's really interesting. But just so you know, this is just from one kind of summarizing source. So there can, of course, be different interpretations and different readings of all of these events, but this is just what my history textbook says, that to me seems relatively balanced. As you may know, in 1789, the French Revolution broke out. Why did this happen? France, like most European countries at the time, had what was called an absolutist monarchy. In the context of France, this was referred to as the Ancien Régime. In an absolutist monarchy, all the power lies with the king and the aristocracy. So every important political, military and clerical role is handed out by the king and his closest circle. There is no parliament, there are no other politicians. All the power lies with the monarch. This often led to some serious issues, and that was also the case with France at the end of the 18th century, when this absolutist monarchy, and as a result of their decisions, the country were in crisis. There was an epidemic of poverty and hunger among the population, while the aristocracy lived in absurd luxury. At the same time, there was a lack of political power for leaders in finance and trade. Because of colonialism and global trade developing, a new group of wealthy people had come about. These were merchants and people who were generally financially very strong as a result of all this new trading going on. There were also more manufacturers, there were more goods being produced, and as a result, there began to emerge a wealthy class that was not aristocracy or nobility. These people had absolutely no political power, even though they had a lot of the financial power. At the same time as well, the state was in a huge financial crisis. They were spending loads and loads of money on luxury, so on the court life essentially, and all the expenses that they had for that, as well as wars, so there was a lot of military expenses, and they had a lot of debt to pay back, because I guess if you want to build something like Versailles, even if you're the king, you can't really afford that. So the state, the monarchy, was very much in debt. And if you look at the spending of the French state during this period, it was absolutely unhinged. So they spent 629 million francs every year, and only 12 of those were used for education and welfare, so for things that aided the general population. Everything else, literally everything else, was for the king's household, for military expenses, and paying back debt. And this was all made worse by the fact that the aristocracy, the richest people in the country, did not have to pay tax. Naturally, as a result of this horrible financial mismanagement, people were not happy at all. This was a very tense base situation. Because of the absolutist monarchy, because of how it works, the whole system was very resistant to reform. You couldn't really do a petition or get parliament to make the king do a certain thing that would maybe be beneficial to the state's finances, because there was no parliament. Of course, wasn't exactly helpful, because the monarchy wasn't, out of their own initiative, willing to change their ways. They weren't going to be like, oh, you know what, we'll, out of the kindness of our hearts, start paying tax. That wasn't going to happen. Simultaneously, there began to be growing political awareness in the population, because at this point in time, the Enlightenment movement had happened. The Enlightenment movement was a sort of philosophical movement in Europe in the 18th century that basically propagated the idea that people can help themselves, that everyone has the ability to learn and understand complicated things, even if they are from a poor background. Because this idea spread, more people than ever were literate and had access to political writings that would also motivate them to look into these issues that plagued their country and that had an effect on their lives. This combination enabled people to form their own opinions and think more critically about the status quo. And understandably, as soon as they started to think critically about the status quo, the population was absolutely infuriated. They realized that they were being exploited by the ruling class, and understandably that made them really fucking mad. In the summer of 1789, this fury and this tension consolidated itself in the shape of two key events that would begin what we now call the French Revolution. The first of these events was the announcement of the National Assembly. The National Assembly consisted of civilians, so people who were not aristocracy or clergy, that were meant to represent the people in the political sphere that had been invited to Versailles to discuss certain issues. But unfortunately, they didn't really get a meaningful vote, and as a result of this, they announced themselves as the National Assembly in the Palace of Versailles. Their aim was basically to fix a constitution. They wanted to create a constitution that would keep the king's powers in check. This was absolutely not allowed in an absolutist monarchy, because the whole point of an absolute monarchy is that there is no constitution and nobody telling the king what to do. Announcing that they wanted to create a constitution was a clear act of rebellion against the monarchy. Later in the summer, the National Assembly doubled down on this by deciding to end the feudal system. They just did that. They abolished the privileged rights of the aristocracy and the clergy, which meant that they now had to pay tax as well, according to the National Assembly. And most importantly, the National Assembly declared a set of human and civil rights, which included equality before the law, the right to free speech, the right to religious freedom, and the right to act freely so long as no one else was harmed by these actions. And these rights would apply to everyone. Now, unfortunately, the National Assembly couldn't just decide this kind of stuff because there was still a king, and the king said no and completely blocked these decisions. That did not go down too well for the king, as you will see. That was the first key event. The second key event was that parallel to the National Assembly creating itself, the people began to act on their own accord. They committed an act that is now seen as the birth of the French Revolution, when on the 14th of July 1789, masses of people stormed the Bastille. The Bastille was originally like a defensive castle that was used against foreign invasion, but for centuries it had functioned as the state prison, and as this, it was a symbol for the unchecked power of the monarchy. So people stormed the Bastille as a symbol for rebelling against the power of the monarch. In this event, the people that stormed the Bastille freed the prisoners, they killed most of the guards and carried their head through Paris in triumph. So we've already started beheadings. First day of French Revolution, we were already beheading people. There was more revolutionary activity during this summer in the countryside. So here we had farmers burning the feudal documents that made them and their land property of the aristocrat overlords, and regional governments were restructured. The real situation of the population's poverty did not change because of these acts. There had been rebellion, but no actual change. So in October of 1789, people were really pissed, and following a demonstration in the streets of Paris, a crowd of people, mostly women working in the markets, walked onto the royal court in Versailles, violently entered the castle, and took the king and his family prisoner and brought them to Paris, into the city, so that they would have to live amongst their subjects, so they would have to see the poverty and the overall horrible circumstances under which their subjects were forced to live. At this point, the National Assembly started to act on its own behalf more and more as well, because somehow the royal power had been breached by this kidnapping. In 1791, the National Assembly published the first French constitution. This constitution still planned for a monarchy to exist, but the king's power should be limited. At this point, all the other monarchies in Europe, as well as the Catholic Church, looked over at France and were like, we don't like what's happening there, because if that happens here too, that's not going to be fun for us. So they began threatening military action against the revolutionary leaders, against the revolutionary regime. And the king and his family, like much of the aristocracy, tried to flee France. This meant that the compromise that the National Assembly had planned of a constitutional monarchy had failed. At the same time, the pressure from abroad, from these other states and the Catholic Church rose. Under this pressure, the revolution becomes radical. It shifts from an attempt at restructuring what is already there. It shifts to what we now call the Reign of Terror. The Reign of Terror was related to radical revolutionary groups, most importantly the Jacobins, increasingly taking control of the country. Thousands of armed civilians stormed the king's residence in 1792 and arrested him. And the king was sentenced to death, and finally he was executed in January 1793 on the guillotine. At the same time, the new parliament struggled with financial issues. There was massive inflation. The people once again became extremely unhappy. And in this turmoil, in this even more difficult situation than earlier on, Robespierre, who was the leader of the Jacobins, took his chance and with it also took power over the country. What followed then was the Jacobin dictatorship. This period lasted about a year, from June 1793 to July 1794, and is known as the Reign of Terror, because during this period the Jacobins executed 16,000 people as enemies of the revolutionary state within a year. That is crazy. The first people to be executed were aristocracy or clergy, and this group also included the Queen Marie Antoinette, who was executed in October 1793. But most of these 16,000 people were civilians who in some way opposed the extreme measures of the Jacobins. Many of them had been pro-revolution at the beginning, they were pro the National Assembly, for example, but they did not agree with the radical version of the revolution that the Jacobins tried to push through. It is here in this period where a movement for justice and equality has suddenly turned into a murderous terror regime. It is in this exact environment, during the Reign of Terror, that we find our stories. It is here that Washington Irving, who we talked about a couple of minutes ago, sets his tale of the woman with the black necklace. And after this long detour into history, which you'll see is very important to this first great wave of women with choker stories, after this excursion, we return to the story itself. Washington Irving's story was the first to take this motif of the woman with the necklace to Paris during the Reign of Terror. It also contains the core characteristics of the early necklaced woman who loses her head story. It was super influential to all the versions that came out in the following years, and it still has a big impact on the contemporary versions as well, because it kind of sums up the core of this motif, and because it's pretty short and it's public domain, we'll have Washington Irving's story of The Woman with the Velvet Necklace in full. The Adventure of the German Student. On a stormy night in the tempestuous times of the French Revolution, a young German was returning to his lodgings at a late hour across the old part of Paris. The lightning gleamed and the loud clasp of thunder rattled through the lofty narrow streets. But I should first tell you something about this young German. Gottfried Wolfgang was a young man of good family. He had studied for some time at Göttingen, but being of a visionary and enthusiastic character, he had wandered into those wild and speculative doctrines which have so often bewildered German students. His secluded life, his intense application, and the singular nature of his studies had an effect on both mind and body. His health was impaired, his imagination diseased. He had been indulging in fanciful speculations on spiritual essences until, like Swedenborg, he had an ideal world of his own going on around him. He took up a notion, I do not know from what cause, that there was an evil influence hanging over him, an evil genius or spirit seeking to ensnare him and ensure his perdition. Such an idea working on his melancholy temperament produced the most gloomy effects. He became haggard and desponding. His friends discovered the mental malady preying upon him and determined that the best cure was a change of scene. He was sent, therefore, to finish his studies amidst the splendours and gaieties of Paris. Wolfgang arrived at Paris at the breaking out of the revolution. The popular delirium at first caught his enthusiastic mind, and he was captivated by the political and philosophical theories of the day. But the scenes of blood which followed shocked his sensitive nature, disgusted him with society and the world, and made him more than ever a recluse. He shut himself up in a solitary apartment in the Pays Latin, the quarter of students. There, in a gloomy street not far from the monastic walls of the Sorbonne, he pursued his favourite speculations. Sometimes he spent hours together in the great library of Paris, those catacombs of departed authors, rummaging among their hoards of dusty and obsolete works in quest of food for his unhealthy appetite. He was, in a manner, a literary ghoul, feeding in the charnel house of decayed literature. Wolfgang, though solitary and recluse, was of an ardent temperament, but for a time it operated merely upon his imagination. He was too shy and ignorant of the world to make any advances to the fair, but he was a passionate admirer of female beauty, and in his lonely chamber would often lose himself in reveries on forms and faces which he had seen, and his fancy would deck out images of loveliness far surpassing the reality. While his mind was in the excited and sublimated state, a dream produced an extraordinary effect upon him. It was of a female face of transcendent beauty. So strong was the impression made that he dreamt of it again and again. It haunted his thoughts by day, his slumbers by night. He became passionately enamored of this shadow of a dream. This lasted so long that it became one of those fixed ideas which haunt the minds of melancholy men and are at times mistaken for madness. Such was Gottfried Wolfgang, and such his situation at the time I mentioned. He was returning home late on a stormy night through some of the old and gloomy streets of the Marais, the ancient part of Paris. The loud claps of thunder rattled among the high houses of the narrow streets. He came to the Place de Grève, the square where public executions were performed. The lightning quivered about the pinnacles of the ancient Hôtel de Ville and shed flickering gleams over the open space in front. As Wolfgang was crossing the square, he shrank back with horror at finding himself close by the guillotine. It was the height of the reign of terror, when this dreadful instrument of death stood ever ready, and its scaffold was continually running with the blood of the virtuous and the brave. It had that very day been actively employed in the work of carnage, and there it stood in grim array amidst a silent and sleeping city, waiting for fresh victims. Wolfgang's heart sickened within him, and he was turning shuddering from the horrible engine, when he beheld a shadowy form cowering as it were at the foot of the steps which led up to the scaffold. A succession of vivid flashes of lightning revealed it more distinctly. It was a female figure dressed in black. She was seated on one of the lower steps of the scaffold, leaning forward, her face hid in her lap, and her long dishevelled tresses hanging to the ground, streaming with the rain which fell in torrents. Wolfgang paused. There was something awful in this solitary monument of woe. The female had the appearance of being above the common order. He knew the times to be full of vicissitude, and that many a fair head which had once been pillowed on down now wandered houseless. Perhaps this was some poor mourner whom the dreadful axe had rendered desolate, and who sat here heartbroken on the strand of existence from which all that was dear to her had been launched into eternity. He approached and addressed her in the accents of sympathy. She raised her head and gazed wildly at him. What was his astonishment at beholding, by the bright glare of the lightning, the very face which had haunted him in his dreams. It was pale and disconsolate, but ravishingly beautiful. Trembling with violent and conflicting emotions, Wolfgang again accosted her. He spoke something of her being exposed at such an hour of the night to the fury of such a storm, and offered to conduct her to her friends. She pointed to the guillotine with a gesture of dreadful signification. "I have no friend on earth," said she. "But you have a home," said Wolfgang. "Yes, in the grave." The heart of the student melted at the words. "If a stranger dare make an offer," said he, "without danger of being misunderstood, I would offer my humble dwelling as a shelter, myself as a devoted friend. I am friendless myself in Paris, and a stranger in the land. But if my life could be of service, it is at your disposal, and should be sacrificed before any harm or indignity should come to you." There was an honest earnestness in the young man's manner that had its effects. His foreign accent, too, was in his favour. It showed him not to be a hackneyed inhabitant of Paris. Indeed, there is an eloquence in true enthusiasm that is not to be doubted. The homeless stranger confided herself implicitly to the protection of the student. He supported her faltering steps across the Pont Neuf, and by the place where the statue of Henry IV had been overthrown by the populace. The storm had abated, and the thunder rumbled at a distance. All Paris was quiet. That great volcano of human passion slumbered for a while, to gather fresh strength for the next day's eruption. The student conducted his charge through the ancient streets of the Belle Latin, and by the dusky walls of the Sorbonne to the great dingy hotel which he inhabited. The old portress who admitted them stared with surprise at the unusual sight of the melancholy Wolfgang, with a female companion. On entering his apartment, the student, for the first time, blushed at the scantiness and indifference of his dwelling. He had but one chamber, an old-fashioned salon, heavily carved and fantastically furnished with the remains of former magnificence, for it was one of those hotels in the quarter nobility. It was lumbered with books and papers and all the usual apparatus of a student, and his bed stood in a recess at one end. When lights were brought and Wolfgang had a better opportunity of contemplating the stranger, he was more than ever intoxicated by her beauty. Her face was pale, but of a dazzling fairness, set off by a profusion of raven hair that hung clustering about it. Her eyes were large and brilliant, with a singular expression approaching almost to wildness. As far as her black dress permitted her shape to be seen, it was of perfect symmetry. Her whole appearance was highly striking, though she was dressed in the simplest style. The only thing approaching to an ornament which she wore was a broad black band round her neck, clasped by diamonds. The perplexity now commenced with the student how to dispose of the helpless being thus thrown upon his protection. He thought of abandoning his chamber to her and seeking shelter for himself elsewhere. Still, He was so fascinated by her charms, there seemed to be such a spell upon his thoughts and senses that he could not tear himself from her presence. Her manner, too, was singular and unaccountable. She spoke no more of the guillotine. Her grief had abated. The attentions of the students had first won her confidence, and then, apparently, her heart. She was evidently an enthusiast like himself, and enthusiasts soon understand each other. In the infatuation of the moment, Wolfgang avowed his passion for her. He told her the story of his mysterious dream and how she had possessed his heart before he had even seen her. She was strangely affected by his recital and acknowledged to have felt an impulse towards him equally unaccountable. It was the time for wild theory and wild actions. Old prejudices and superstitions were done away. Everything was under the sway of the goddess of reason. Among other rubbish of the old times, the forms and ceremonies of marriage began to be considered superfluous bonds for honourable minds. Social compact were the vogue. Wolfgang was too much of a theorist not to be tainted by the liberal doctrines of the day. "Why should we separate?" said he. "Our hearts are united. In the eye of reason and honour we are as one. What need is there of solid forms to bind high souls together?" The stranger listened with emotion. She had evidently received illumination at the same school. "You have no home nor family," continued he. "Let me be everything to you, or rather let us be everything to one another. If form is necessary, form shall be observed. There is my hand. I pledge myself to you forever." "Forever?" said the stranger solemnly. "Forever," repeated Wolfgang. The stranger clasped the hand extended to her. "Then I am yours," murmured she, and sank upon his bosom. The next morning the student left his bride sleeping and sallied forth at an early hour to seek more spacious apartments suitable to the change in his situation. When he returned, he found the stranger lying with her head hanging over the bed and one arm thrown over it. He spoke to her but received no reply. He advanced to awaken her from her uneasy posture. On taking her hand, it was cold. There was no pulsation. Her face was pallid and ghastly. In a word, she was a corpse. Horrified and frantic, he alarmed the house. A scene of confusion ensued. The police was summoned. As the officer of police entered the room, he started back on beholding the corpse. "Great heaven!" cried he. "How did this woman come here?" "Do you know anything about her?" said Wolfgang eagerly. "Do I?" exclaimed the officer. "She was guillotined yesterday." He stepped forward, undid the black collar around the neck of the corpse, and the head rolled on the floor. The student burst into a frenzy. The fiend has gained possession of me," shrieked he. "I am lost forever." They tried to soothe him, but in vain. He was possessed with the frightful belief that an evil spirit had reanimated the dead body to ensnare him. He went distracted and died in a madhouse. Here the old gentleman with the haunted head finished his narrative. "And is this really a fact?" said the inquisitive gentleman. "A fact not to be doubted," replied the other. "I had it from the best authority. The student told it me himself. I saw him in a madhouse in Paris." That was a fun story, wasn't it? If you understand fun to mean pretty damn creepy, and I absolutely do. Now, most importantly for us in this episode is that this short story contains all the key elements of the first wave of woman with necklace stories. There's a young man, a student, who is usually but not always German, in this case he is, and he's a little bit of a weirdo, with the digging through all those archives and stuff like that. He tends to be kind of goth. So this guy, our little goth boy, encounters a gorgeous woman with a suspicious black velvet choker, well, to us it's suspicious, to him it's not. And he is instantly infatuated with her the moment he sees her. He takes her home, they have sex, and the next morning he finds her dead. Upon this discovery, he calls for help, and an authority figure appears to help him. This authority figure then informs the student that the woman was executed the previous day. The student can't believe it. After all, she was quite alive last night, but to prove that she is dead, the authority figure removes her necklace and her head drops to the floor. The young man is convinced that the woman's body was instrumentalized by a demon or the devil to seduce him and make him do stuff he should not be doing with the dead person, to make him sin. A horrible, ghostly scam, one might say. Personally, I say it also sounds suspiciously like a half-baked excuse by someone who needs to explain the presence of a murdered person in their room and can't think of anything more convincing than ghosts, but that is a fringe theory and will not play any further role in this analysis. But what does play a role for this analysis are the setting and the themes of the story. Namely, that is the decaying city of Paris, the recluse student's desire for the executed woman, the topic of resurrection, and the sources of horror in the tale. One thing we need to consider is that Irving's story was written in 1824, so 30 years after the end of the Reign of Terror. So he was writing about events that took place in the past, during a time when Irving himself was a child and lived on a different continent. Because remember, he was American, he was born in New York, he was nowhere near Paris during the Revolution. The Paris he writes about is therefore a sort of literary reconstruction from a temporal and geographical distance. He is building a dark romantic version of Paris. And this is something that's kind of typical for ghost stories in general, that they are often set in the past, in a kind of distant gothic past. And especially during this period in the 19th century, a lot of early US writers, like Hawthorne as well, for example, they would often set their ghost stories in Europe, in the old world. The significance of Europe in these ghost stories is pretty crucial. From this US perspective, Europe was a place of the decaying old, of like a dying glory and the historical past. Its glory days were seen as being over, because now there was a new world that attempted to be the place of great opportunity. Of course, there's like a lot of colonialism involved in that. As always, there's always colonialism. What's interesting is that Irving in this story really emphasizes in his description of Paris this decaying quality. The libraries become catacombs. Institutions like the Hôtel de Ville and the Sorbonne University are referred to as ancient. The streets are narrow and gloomy and dark. Paris truly is an ancient, haunted city in Irving's tale, where the past lingers despite how desolate it has become. And now, if we combine this with the bloody horrors and the many executions of the Reign of Terror, it becomes the perfect place for a story about ghosts and resurrection. Thousands of potential ghosts are being produced all the time, and the past that inhabits the place refuses to die and therefore brings back these ghosts with it. Both the ancient decaying city of Paris and the dead woman come back to life are elements of the past that return to haunt the present. A lot of the time, hauntings and ghosts are read to mean just that, a past that keeps influencing the present in a haunting and terrifying way. Now, the woman first appears as an idealized image in Wolfgang's dreams. Then he meets her in real life, and in a third step it is revealed that she was dead all along, while they had sex, while he fell madly in love with her. This comes to show that this whole love story between them is an illusion, beginning with the imaginary and ending with the haunting and the past. And this can be interpreted as the beautiful and the desirable being deceiving. That what seems desirable is actually already dead and gone. And in the context of a time defined by change, like the French Revolution, it's easy to read this idea of deception and the desirable being already past in a political sense. The beautiful and the desirable is killed off by the guillotine, by the terror. It's possible that this is a way to say that the beginnings of the revolution were promising and glorious, but at the moment where the executions began, these extremes of killing, the glory that could have been achieved by the revolution, were put into the past. It could also be read in a sort of more royalist sense to say that the revolution itself ended the glory of the monarchy, although I think that is a less likely interpretation for a US author at the time. What I think is clear that there is a certain yearning for the past in the tumultuous times of the terror. The executed woman who comes back to life and is the most beautiful of all, she could possibly be a symbol for this failure of the revolution that at the same time refuses to admit it has failed. The revolution keeps resurrecting itself to continue to lure people in and to kill and to destroy. That would be a possible interpretation. There is an article by Maria Believa Solomon about guillotined women's stories, and in this she links this type of tale to the late romantic obsession with reanimation. The late romantic sort of literary period is kind of the tail end of traditional Gothic literature. And if you listen to this podcast, you already know quite a bit about late romantic literature because we talked about it in episode 1. Frankenstein is a classic example of this late romantic literature and very much of the obsession with reanimation. Because of course Victor builds a person from dead bodies and brings that person to life. He's piecing together the past and then resurrecting it, if we go with this kind of past-present idea of resurrection. Now the difference here is that Victor Frankenstein does this with a lot of purpose. He does it very deliberately. It's his desire to bring back the past and is very evident. With the German student, this is a little bit more subtle. He doesn't go around trying to make people out of dead bodies or something like that, but he is kind of lost in the present, right? He is lost in this terrible situation of the Reign of Terror. Irving writes that he can't deal with the bloodshed and the violence, and because of that, he retreats into the past. Irving writes that Wolfgang, who is shocked by the brutality of the revolution, withdraws to and seeks comfort in writings of the past and in his dream world. And to quote from the text, sometimes he spent hours together in the great libraries of Paris, those catacombs of departed authors, rummaging among their hordes of dusty and obsolete works in quest of food for his unhealthy appetite. He was, in a manner, a literary ghoul, feeding in the charnel house of decayed literature. Wolfgang is clearly attracted to that which is gone, and even to death in a sense. You know, if we look at how Irving describes this, he's a ghoul, he feeds in the charnel house of decayed literature. There's a lot of imagery of death and decay that Wolfgang feasts on, and through this he kind of becomes a remnant of bygone eras himself. He's very isolated and he seems uncomfortable with the present. The past is where he belongs more comfortably. And because of this, I think it also makes sense that he specifically is attracted to this woman who is dead, who is a remnant of the past, a single piece of the past stuck in the present. So let's talk about the woman, the spectre herself, in a bit more detail. We know very little about her. She's nameless, and all the information we have about her is inferred from her appearance and the few lines that she says. Interestingly, she doesn't try to hide the fact that she's dead. She literally replies to him that her home is in the grave. So, you know, maybe he's a little dum-dum, I don't know. It is kind of on the nose looking back at the story that she is dead. But again, that is all she can tell us about her background. So everything else has to be pieced together from her looks. Of course, she wears the black velvet band around her neck. It is clasped by diamonds and covers the place where her head was cut from her body by the guillotine. Both of these things, that she wears this kind of richly decorated jewelry and also that she was executed, hint towards her being aristocracy or being very wealthy. And in fact, Irvin mentions in the text that she seems to belong to a higher order. So I think we can safely assign her to the old regime that is being taken down. And we will in fact hear a little bit more about how her necklace links her to the aristocracy killed by the revolution later on in this episode. But so far I think we can say she's from a wealthy background. She seems to be the target audience of the revolution's killing. All that remains of her is a figure that is fragmented. Essentially, she doesn't really have a personality or a character. The thing that mainly defines her is her death, the fragmentation of her as a figure. What I mean by that is that she is a character in whom there are no clear boundaries left. To explain this, I briefly need to talk about psychoanalytic theory. We're going to simplify it so it doesn't get too complicated. In psychoanalytic kind of literary analysis, there is the idea that horror and fear arise when we can't categorize things, when something breaks or dissolves the boundaries that we typically use to structure society and that are ingrained in the way that a lot of people perceive and understand the world around them. You know, these are categories like human and animal, or male and female, culture and nature, good and evil. So they are simply the typical categories that are generally used to classify and understand things and people, and the boundaries that separate these binary categories. Psychoanalytic theory says that when these pairs cannot be separated very well, or when the boundaries between them become blurry or break entirely, that is when horror arises. And the woman with the necklace really violates such categories. She especially violates the boundary between the inside and the outside of the body, and the boundary between life and death. Those are both very crucial boundaries, and ones that we often see crossed in horror. I want to briefly talk about both of them. It is probably relatively evident how the inside and outside of the body aren't separated in a person whose head has been cut off. Her body has literally been fragmented and opened up. It's not a closed entity with an inside and outside anymore. But what is fascinating is that a simple band of fabric can put her body back together. It can make it look whole again. But then again, it can be removed and then the body falls apart once more. So it is a body that is fragmented, where inside and outside are difficult to separate, and it is very unstable. It can be put together and taken apart over and over again. Very disturbing if we work with an idea of the body as a closed entity with an inside and an outside. She's completely throwing that overboard. The boundaries of that body are all over the place. And of course, from this, we get this notion of the horrifying and the disturbing. The second boundary that she breaks is that between life and death. And this is also something that we see a lot with supernatural horror creatures like vampires and zombies. We have a figure that is not really dead and not really alive. Of course, she is dead, she's been decapitated, but she can act, she perceives, she moves, she speaks, she even engages in sexual activity like a living person. She's fragmented in her whole being, with her body being dead, but her consciousness still functions. That's uncomfortable to think about if we consider the boundary between life and death as one of the sort of crucial differentiations that we need to categorize the world and life and understand what is going on around us. That makes it very, very difficult if we can't even separate life and death. So that is the second source of horror in this story. and of course one that fits in very well into a period with so much death. Interestingly, during the French Revolution, there was quite a bit of debate around whether the guillotined could feel pain or not, whether, they could still perceive their surroundings after being beheaded. And according to Solomon, there's kind of the theory that maybe this story is also rooted in that kind of fear. So we are talking about a story where two crucial sets of boundaries that help us understand the world and rationalize it are broken. The student's reaction to realizing that these boundaries don't hold up is to go mad. In this theoretical construct, madness is the classic response to these crucial boundaries being broken, because nothing makes sense anymore. So you might as well lose your mind. So I think the horror of this story really comes from this boundary breaking, things not staying in the place that where they're supposed to be staying, if we want to keep like a neat order. So that is my initial analysis of the trope of the decapitated woman with the necklace in itself, based on Irving's version of the story. I said earlier that Washington Irving's Adventure of the German Student sort of put the executed woman with the necklace on the literary map, and he does seem to have been the first one to take it to the iconic setting of Reign of Terror Paris, to the place that would remain the woman with the choker's haunt for a long time. But Irving didn't come up with the story out of nowhere. As Solomon puts it, Irving builds his own narrative from scavenged fragments of existing stories. There's evidence for several different stories of executed women seducing men in reanimated form and being found dead soon after, existing prior to Irving's story. And originally they probably go back to a tale of French origin, which then carried over into like English language literature. It's pretty likely that this story comes from an early modern religious pamphlet where a rake, like in Bridgerton, is struck by madness after accidentally sleeping with an executed woman who was reanimated by the devil to trick him. So kind of a similar baseline story. This version, this pamphlet, comes from the early 1600s. It does seem like this pamphlet is very much the basis of the first English language literary text about this topic, because it is very, very similar to it. And this is a text that Irving mentions in the foreword of The Adventure of the German Student. It is a story by a writer called Horace Smith. Smith published his story titled Sir Guy Eveling's Dream in 1823. So this was 1 year before Irving, and also bang in this late romantic period where we get a lot of resurrection stories from. Now, Smith's version is a little bit different. It takes place in London, where a guy called Guy is living a scandalous life of drinking and gambling and consorting with women who are far from respectable, instead of being a good boy and marrying like his sister keeps telling him to do. So I think here we clearly see the influence of the religious pamphlet. One early morning, when the guy called Guy comes back from a night of drinking, suddenly he sees a beautiful, elegant woman standing at the foot of his bed. He calls her wondrously delectable. Upon seeing this wondrously delectable woman, Guy thinks, oh well, this has to be a prank by my mates, because he's an actual frat boy. Personally, I prefer Irving's like depressed goth emo artist boy, but to each their own. This is the version for the girlies who like their corporate frat boy lads, I suppose. So frat boy Guy sees this lady at the foot of his bed, and she is wearing a ruff around her neck. And like any normal person, the guy called Guy decides to take it off her because he thinks ruffs aren't cool. Upon Guy trying to take her clothes off, the woman shrieks and vanishes into thin air. The only correct response in this situation. Well, she could have hit him as well. Remember this point of Guy trying to remove the woman's ruff against her will. It'll come back in the second part of this two-parter in a major way. So, very similar to Irving's tale, Guy becomes obsessed with this woman. He decides he wants to marry her, and then he does everything to find her. And eventually he does, and they become more intimate. Now, she takes off her ruff in front of him, and underneath that, she wears a broad black velvet necklace, richly decorated. And once again, Cold Guy wants to remove it, but she shrieks again, rightly so. This man needs to get a grip. And like Irving's version, at the end, the woman is found dead. Her necklace is removed by a police officer, and underneath that, they find bruises and cuts from a rope round her neck. It is then revealed that she's an Italian lady who was hanged a few days earlier for stabbing her lover in a jealous rage. Like the German student, Guy goes mad because he believes an evil spirit tried to trick him, and he dies shortly after in a madhouse, also having all his logic break down because the boundary between life and death has been ruptured right in front of his eyes. There are a few key differences between this version and Irving's. The location and the historical context are clearly very different. Because of that, also the method of execution. And there's less of a political tone to it, right? Because we don't have this politically very salient situation of the revolution going on in the background. Instead, there's much more of a kind of moral tone to it, where the man, who is utterly unlikable, kind of repeatedly attempts to remove the woman's necklace against her will. And he's, from the beginning, kind of shown to be this sort of unreliable, rakish guy rather than Irving's more romantic figure. And of course, the consent question comes up here very clearly. It's not something that we really have in the Irving version all that much, but here it's very important, with this repeated action of Guy trying to remove the woman's necklace, and she shrieks and disappears. And this consent question will crop up again later in this episode, and in a major way, as I already said, in part 2. So far we have discussed only English language versions of the Necklaced Woman tale, and that is the overall focus of this double episode. But given how central the French context is to this motif, it would be kind of negligent to leave out the guillotined woman's French afterlife, as Solomon charmingly calls it. The first French story about the returning dead woman guillotined in the Reign of Terror dates to 1830, and it is titled L'inconnu, so the unknown or the stranger. It's also by an unknown author, interestingly, but in the title, this inconnu refers to the woman because we don't know who she is. The main difference between this story and the others is that the student does not go mad after watching his beloved's head fall off, but he wakes up from a horrific nightmare. So here we have the "it was all a dream" resolution. The student wakes up to hear bells and chants that celebrate a victory of Napoleon. So he lives in a period where the reign of terror that he just dreamt of is clearly over and in the past. And he lives in a new age that is being celebrated and that seems to be bringing glory and prosperity. But interestingly, for the author and the reader in 1830, this seemingly glorious reign of Napoleon is also already a failed past attempt at greatness as well. I won't go into too much detail regarding Napoleon because this episode is already 300 years long anyway, but let's just say that his government engaged in quite a bit of state-sanctioned violence as well. Much of the work that the revolution had actually done to create more equality for the population was undone, and in the mid-1810s, Napoleon's empire failed. So, in this 1830 story, we have a circular shape at the end where history repeats itself, where the student wakes up from a horrific vision of the Reign of Terror only to find himself in a reality that the reader already knows is going to fail as well. For the reader, there is this repetition, a repetition of history that ties nicely into the concept of resurrecting the dead over and over again. this French vein of the guillotined woman story is also resurrected repeatedly throughout the 1830s and 1840s. Most famously, and in its most expanded form, it was brought back to life in 1849 by the French author Alexandre Dumas, the son, not the daddy, who you might know from stories like The Lady of the Camellias, and it is his story that we will turn to next. Dumas' version of the story of the guillotined woman has the lovely title La femme au collier de velours, the woman with the velvet necklace, and it is truly the director's cut extended version of the story. It's a novella of about 200 pages, which is long, and it takes about 120 of those 200 pages until said woman with the velvet necklace actually appears. So there is a lot of backstory. We're not going to go too much into the backstory because it would take us forever, but we'll look at the points that are the most important. La femme au collier de velours takes place in 1793, the year of grace or disgrace, as Dumas calls it. And this was, of course, the year that King Louis XVI was beheaded on the guillotine and the Jacobin Reign of Terror began. The story, however, doesn't begin in Paris, but in Germany. And specifically, it starts by introducing us to the protagonist, who is none other than the writer E.T.A. Hoffmann himself. Now, if you went to school in a German-speaking country, you know this guy. He's the original German Schauerromantik boy. Schauerromantik is basically the German equivalent to Gothic literature. In Dumas' story, he has a little emo haircut that veils his eyes. He's a little sickly and melancholy, a bit mentally unstable, a true romantic poet. And this is, of course, interesting given that I mentioned earlier on that there was a kind of obsession with resurrection in late romantic literature. So it's kind of interesting that this protagonist is a well-known writer of romantic literature. I want to very, very briefly mention a book by E.T.A. Hoffmann that is kind of interesting in relation to this tale and that I think might have been the reason why Dumas chose this historical figure as the main character of his story. And that is that Hoffmann wrote a book called Der Sandmann, which again, if you went to high school in a German-speaking country, you might have had to read that. I had to read it in high school. And this is a book about a young man who becomes obsessed with a young woman called Olympia, who is very, very beautiful, but cold and empty of emotion. And at the end of the story, he realizes that she is not a real person, but a mechanical automaton. And when he realizes that, he goes quite mad. Not that he was okay before. He was kind of traumatized because he saw his father be killed, or he thinks he saw his father be killed by some other guy when he was a child. It's a little bit complicated, but Bestie is not okay. Afterward, he's even less okay. He completely loses it and throws himself off a church tower. Very neat. because there are so many parallels between the student who finds out that the woman he desires has been dead all along and is driven mad by this, and this character written by Hoffmann who realizes that the woman he loves is basically a machine and is then driven mad by this. So there's some cool, fun intertextuality there for you. And we continue with the intertextuality because similar to the protagonist of Der Sandmann, Hoffmann in The Woman with the Velvet Necklace sees a girl from a distance and he instantly falls in love with her. This young woman is called Antonia. She is the good girl in this story. She is very talented and beautiful and pure, and Hoffmann is very much in love with her in a respectable fashion. That's important. They become friends. He talks to her father. They get the permission to get engaged. It's all very prim and proper. Before he met Antonia, Hoffmann had planned to go to Paris with one of his pals, and he and Antonia decide that he should still go and that they will get married when he returns. Before he leaves for Paris, Hoffmann swears to Antonia on her life that he will be faithful to her and also that he will not gamble. We all know what's going to happen, don't we? But alas, Hoffmann swears this oath, I repeat, on Antonia's life, so if he breaks the oath, she will die. He swears this oath, then he travels to Paris, and with him he takes a locket with Antonia's picture inside it. Upon arriving in Paris, Hoffmann is super disappointed by what he finds. The city is grey, the museums and the libraries that he was so excited to see are closed. He talks to a man at the door of the Louvre, and he says that the Free French don't want to gaze upon images of enslaved people, and that the paintings have likely been burned in the manufacturers of weapons of war anyway. So here we get this first notion of the destructiveness of the Reign of Terror that has started at this point, right? It kills art and it kills beauty. A bit of foreshadowing for the way we then see the Reign of Terror kill people as well, and especially kill beautiful ladies, because that's especially bad, you know, because they were hot and it's like, oh no, don't die, you're too sexy, you know, that kind of vibe. So we already get the idea that Dumas is critical of this late stage revolution, of the violence and the all-encompassing cruelty. And this is exemplified by the daily executions on the guillotine, and they come in very quickly. After he arrives in Paris, Hoffmann rents a room and he speaks to his landlady, and she talks about the executions. And this is what she says. At first, they guillotined wicked aristocrats, it seems. Those people carried their heads so high, and they all had such an insolent, insulting way about them that pity didn't moisten our eye very readily. So we looked on willingly enough. It was a fine sight to see the struggle of those bold enemies of the nation against death. But one day I saw an old man on the tumbril with his head jolting against the slats. It was a sad sight. The next day I saw some nuns. Another day I saw a child of 14, and last of all I saw a girl in one tumbril and her mother in another, and the two poor creatures throwing kisses to each other without a word. They were so pale, their expression was so sad, the smile on their lips so ghastly, the fingers, which were the only part of them that moved as they took the kisses from their mouths, were so white and trembled so that I shall never forget the horrid sight, and I have sworn never to run the risk of seeing such another. I think this paragraph exemplifies very well how the revolution is perceived as something that started out for fair reasons and with fair intentions, and well, there were people who kind of had to die for the political goal, but that then descended into a sort of mindless killing on the guillotine. So this gives us a bit of a baseline of the story's approach to the revolution. Now, shortly after this, Hoffmann also sees his first execution. Yay! That is the execution of a Madame du Barry, who was a mistress of the king, and he sees her be carted to the Place de la Révolution, where the guillotine stands. And Hoffmann follows the cart as, quote, one more ghost added to the procession of spectres that formed the last escort of the king's favourite. So here Hoffmann describes himself as a ghost, and we see how even the living are dead under this reign of terror. Hoffmann then sees Madame de Barry be executed, and he is shocked by the brutality of her death and the sight of her beheaded corpse. He never wants to see the guillotine and another execution ever again, so he's really disturbed by this. And as anybody does, he decides to distract himself by going to the opera. It is here that finally our woman with the velvet necklace makes her entrance. She is a ballet dancer who dances in the opera called Arsène. When Hoffmann sees Arsène, he is instantly shaken and completely taken in by her great beauty and he notices that she wears a black velvet necklace that is closed with a diamond-studded clasp in the shape of a guillotine. Might that be a hint? Who knows? Long before laying eyes on Arsène, Hoffmann meets a guy also at the opera, a doctor, who has a little skull-shaped diamond-studded snuff box that forms a counterpart to Arsène's guillotine necklace. So we have the skull and the guillotine that kind of make a matching pair together. This is mostly so we can later identify the doctor when I mention him again. It's kind of mysterious how he is related to the whole thing. But we just need to know who he is because he'll come up again. Back to Arsène. While Arsène dances, her body becomes fragmented in Hoffmann's perception and becomes mingled and confused with the mutilated body of Madame du Barry, who he just saw being executed. And here I want to quote from the text again because it's very interesting. Here we go. But the dance continued, and the hallucination was so complete that Hoffmann's mind, dwelling upon the two strongest impressions of the day, confused the stage before him with Place de la Révolution, and sometimes he fancied that he saw Madame du Barry's headless body dancing in Arsène's place, and sometimes that Arsène came dancing to the foot of the guillotine and into the executioner's hands. In the young man's excited imagination there was a medley of flowers and blood, of dancing and the death agony of life and death. So we see in his imagination the dancer and the executed woman really become one, consumed into one another. Interestingly, it is following this description where Arsène becomes associated with the guillotined woman that Hoffmann gets really, really horny. It's actually quite explicit how Dumas describes this. So we get Hoffmann feeling hot and parched whenever Arsène's skirt rises a little higher and he sees a bit more of her legs, and then desire seizes him and he's like super nervous and he gets hot flushes and he's very, very thirsty. And this is interesting because it comes on very instantaneously in this sexual way, because before that he just thinks she's beautiful, but once this mingling with Madame du Barry happens, the attraction becomes very physical and very sexual. I find this super, super interesting, that this specific type of attraction is defined as very sexual, and that the guillotine necklace appears to be a catalyst for Hoffmann's physical attraction to Arsène. And it really is here that we get the moment of highest arousal up until the very end of the story. And that this exact moment is mixed in with the memory of the execution Hoffmann saw earlier that day and that really, really disturbed him. We have attraction and repulsion happening at the exact same time and kind of heightening one another. It's also worth pointing out that apparently Hoffmann is not simply attracted to the woman who then happens to turn out to have been guillotined, but his attraction is increased because of the association with the guillotine and the executed body of Madame du Barry. We kind of get the idea that there's some sort of physical attraction to maybe the concept of death or the concept of destruction or possibly the dead body itself. And let's contrast this with Hoffmann's very pure love for Antonia that is a lot more romantic and based on emotions like admiration and admiring her skills and her talent, and it is a lot less sexual. In fact, he doesn't really mention any specifically sexual feelings for her. This pure love, I'm just calling it that as like a shorthand, this pure love is now under serious threat because it looks as though Hoffmann might not keep his oath of being true to Antonia now that he's super excited about Arsène. And we also know that if he breaks his oath, Antonia will die. Although we now also know that Hoffmann might be into that, so who knows, maybe this is like killing two birds with one stone. I don't know. Hoffmann's a weirdo. Despite being a weirdo, he realizes that he's about to break his oath, and flees from the theatre and runs into his pal, who he ages ago agreed to go to Paris with. He's a bit of a gambler, so here we get the second part of the oath, right? And he asks Hoffman to come along to the place where he does his gambling, but Hoffman says no because of his oath. But the next second, he decides to return to the opera and wait at the stage for Arsène, like a complete idiot. I'm sorry if you can hear that. These are like the fucking helicopters that are taking people to the fucking WEF so they can plan how to better destroy the planet. They're also being super noisy and annoying while they're doing that. Villains. Anyway, Hoffman is an idiot and returns to the theatre. And I don't know about you, but I love it when people in stories run knowingly and purposefully straight into their own demise, as Hoffman is doing right now. It is a little bit delicious. I love the dramatic irony, even though this one is not even dramatic irony because he knows that something bad's going to happen if he breaks his oath, but he's just an idiot. But fortunately, he's also a bit of a lucky idiot because nothing happens that night. He only sees Arsène drive away with her creepy boyfriend in his creepy coach. Hoffman follows them for a little bit, but then he loses them, upon which he goes home and tries not to have a wank. That's my interpretation. The story says something like, he lies down and tries very hard to control himself. I think that means he's trying not to have a wank. Now, 2 days later, Hoffman returns to the opera, but Arsène has disappeared. She does not dance in the ballet anymore. But he finds the doctor with the diamond skull snuff box, and he tells Hoffman that Arsène's boyfriend made her leave the ballet because some lad made eyes at her from the audience and ran after their carriage. And Hoffman is like, tee, that's me. She fancies me too, so much that her boyfriend is jealous of me. Through some shady business conducted by the doctor, Hoffman is then hired to paint Arsène in the nude. Can you imagine the scandal? Now, at this point, I thought that maybe the doctor is like the devil or something. That doesn't really get resolved. He might be. But he's clearly bringing Hoffman closer to the temptation, right? By arranging this painting situation. Because Hoffman's also a painter. He does everything. He writes and he paints and he is being stupid, all the artist stuff. So he's in Arsène's house and they're getting ready for the painting, and Arsène takes off her clothes, and while she does this, Hoffman almost dies of a thirst-induced heart attack. He kisses her hand and Arsène is like, what are you doing? What are you doing touching me? You go over there and paint the bloody portrait, which he does for 3 seconds before running up to her and trying to kiss her. And at this point, fortunately, Arsène's maid kicks him out of the house. Good maid. Maid and bodyguard. Very, very well done. So Hoffman, who is now also kind of a sex offender, stands in the street all alone, realizing that Arsène really only hired him as a painter and not because she secretly fancies him, and that he's only a miserable little creep plus breaker of his oath. It's going very well. It's going uphill like crazy for him, right? And if that wasn't bad enough, his pal shows up again, and this time he convinces Hoffman to break the second part of his oath too, to go gambling. And you know why? So he can get money to impress Arsène with, so that he can then even better break the already broken promise of being faithful to Antonia. A true collection of geniuses we've got here with these two guys, yeah? The gambling takes place at the former Palais Royal, which was a sign of the monarchy, but has become a gambling den and a brothel, and it shines brightly with sin every night. And as Dumas describes it, it is a horrific, disrespectful place where people who know their lives may end at any moment under the reign of terror flock to enjoy the life that they still have left in the excess to the extreme while it lasts. And he describes this with some very metal lines. People were dancing not on the volcano, but in the crater itself, and their lungs, accustomed to an air of sulphur and lava, were no longer content with the mild perfumes of other days. One must live as one was likely to die, rapidly. Gorgeous. I love it. The man can write. And live rapidly is precisely what Hoffman does. He bets all his gold and loses it within minutes, without a sou left to his name, but caught in the spiral of the game, still clinging to the hope that if he were rich he could win Arsene's love. He pawns the last valuable thing he owns, the locket that Antonia gave him when he swore his oath to her. What a lovely chap. But with the gold he borrows, with the locket as a pawn, he wins and wins and wins. Hoffman then takes his winnings to Arsène to buy her love, as he calls it, but she's gone, she's disappeared. It turns out her boyfriend has been arrested by the Jacobins and she has had to flee. Nobody knows where she is. Distraught, Hoffman wanders the city and he ends up at Place de la Révolution, the place he never wanted to return to. The place where the guillotine stands like a hungry creature, where, quote, the ghastly machine whose mouth, wet with blood, was dried by the night wind as it slept, awaiting the coming quota of its daily victims. And I think we all know what happens next. By the side of the scaffold, Hoffman finds a woman kneeling on the ground. A woman wearing an airy dress, meaning she's scantily clad, her shoulders and neck are bare, and around her neck she wears a black velvet choker with a diamond clasp in the shape of the guillotine. It is Arsène, of course. But her speech is strangely automatic, her lips pale and her movements abrupt. First, Arsène doesn't really want to go with Hoffman, she's not very responsive. She decides to come and hook up with him after he literally shouts, "I am rich, I have gold," because he's not desperate at all. What he is ashamed to take her to his shabby little hotel room. And this shows us how crucial material wealth is as ever, despite the revolutionaries' claims of equality. Fortunately, Arsène knows a cool hotel, and that's where she guides Hoffman to. On the way to the hotel, Dumas drops myriads of hints that there is something not quite alive about Arsène. Her body is cold as ice. She feels no hunger. In fact, she says she can't eat. She holds on to her head with both hands as though she needs to keep it in place. Blood drips from underneath her necklace. She doesn't feel a burning log falling onto her foot. We get the hint. For us readers, this clearly points to her being dead. For Hoffman, I understand that he doesn't come to that conclusion, but I still think it's super weird that he doesn't interpret this as, oh, she's in shock or she's upset. She seems to be injured. Like, she's literally bleeding from her neck, and he doesn't think of, oh, she might be injured when she's bleeding. He's a dum-dum. So if we were to assume, as a person in Hoffman's position might, that, you know, she's in shock, she's alone, she needs help, she's injured, that means she's very vulnerable, and Hoffman is the only one helping her. And also he's constantly telling her how rich he is and that all his money is for her and he will help her. Maybe, just maybe, sleeping with her in this situation is not very consensual because she depends on him for not being left out in the street and for having money to live on. I think we call that a power imbalance. So Hoffman is successfully continuing his career of being a fucking creep. Alas, they arrive in the hotel room and Hoffman drinks. He drinks a lot. He gets so pissed that he can trick himself into thinking that Arsène is totally into him. To quote, she seemed to derive animation not from the wine she drank herself, but from the wine that Hoffman drank. He's literally getting himself deliberately so drunk that he can convince himself that she's into him. Just stop it, Hoffman. He doesn't stop it. He plays the piano, Arsène dances, he loses it, they have sex. There's a bit of hellfire imagery, fire that penetrates into the deepest recesses of their beings, and then they fall asleep. Success. The next morning, and you know what's coming. Hoffman wakes up and goes, Arsène seems a bit unconscious and pale and cold and has no heartbeat. That's weird. Better call some help. And this is the first somewhat reasonable thing he's done since he first saw Arsène at the opera. By possibly supernatural coincidence, it is the doctor with the diamond skull who comes to Hoffman's aid when he calls. And the doctor goes, "Oh, it was good of you to retrieve her body from the gutter." Which I think is an interesting response to finding the body of a recently executed person in the bed of a guy who was incredibly thirsty for her all the time. My response would not be, "Oh, well done." It would be, "What the fuck is her corpse doing in your bed that you've evidently been in yourself just moments ago? I am calling the police." Although that might actually make things even worse, but let's not start with fucked up shit members of the police force have done with the dead bodies, because that is too horrific for even this episode. We're just gonna go back to the story and not question why the doctor doesn't think it's weird that her body is in his bed. The doctor tells Hoffman that Arsène was executed the previous day, and Hoffman says he does not believe it, because obviously, they were interacting the night before. And as we've already seen it before, the doctor then proves Arsène's death by opening the clasp of her necklace, and her head, now that it is no longer held onto her body by the necklace, drops to the floor and rolls to Hoffman's feet. And as we also already know from the other stories, the young man is distraught and erratic. He runs out into the street and shouts at people, and because of this, he is apprehended by authorities. He tells them the story of the woman who was quite alive the night before, and when he woke up, she was dead. Again, that just sounds so much like a lie, like something you would say to cover up that you killed her, but alas. The authorities are like, "Okay, prove it to us. Show us where this lady is, and then we can maybe see we can identify her and confirm that she was executed." And now, in a gorgeous American Psycho-esque plot twist, they return to the street where Hoffman got the hotel room for Arsène and himself, but there is no trace of her. There is no trace of the room, not even of the building where our protagonist spent the past night. Everything is gone. Of course, Hoffman is even more confused at this, and naturally nobody believes him. But what they do find is the little doctor with the diamond skull, who caringly lays a hand on Hoffman's shoulder and announces to the people following him that the poor fellow escaped from a mental asylum, which he will take him back to now. But he doesn't do that. He puts Hoffman in coach and then tells him to instantly return to Germany, for France is not a good place for men with such imaginations as yours. So basically, we don't really know what happened. It's unclear, again, American Psycho-esque. It's unclear whether the past night really happened or if it was sort of an illusion. Hoffman, second reasonable thing he does is that he decides to follow the doctor's advice and return to Germany to marry Antonia after all. But before he can do that, he goes back to the money changer who he pawned Antonia's locket to on the previous night. So he wants to pay him and get the locket back. And by some other great coincidence, the money changer happens to be besties with Antonia's father. And so he reveals to Hoffman that Antonia's father sent him a letter a few days ago informing him that his beloved daughter Antonia died 8 days before, at the very moment when Hoffman, hired to paint Arsène's portrait, lost his composure and kissed her shoulder. Deathly pale, trembling, crushed, Hoffman opened the locket in order to put Antonia's image to his lips. But the ivory was as white and spotless as if it had never been touched by the brush of the painter. Because of course the oath came back to bite this idiot. We all knew he should have known. Stupid. But, contrary to what it might seem, the point of this episode is not to bully Hoffman, although I think we can call it a secondary goal because he is being stupid. But what I really want to examine is the presence that looms over both stories. The presence that is darker than the night sky and that pulls together all the different aspects of these narratives. The guillotine. In this first wave of beheaded women with necklace stories, the guillotine stands at the center of the narrative. It connects the political horror of the times with the student's personal horror story, the ideological concept of terror with the physical destruction of the body. The guillotine creates, in the service of the reign of terror, the ghosts that haunt Wolfgang and Hoffmann. These ghosts take both the form of the visible public violence and the distress that the young men experience when they see this, when they see the executions, but it also takes the form of the actual ghost, of the woman with the velvet necklace, and the sort of tainted sexual desires that the protagonists feel for her. And it is the guillotine in these stories that physically and metaphorically kills off the beautiful and the desirable. The guillotine kills off, if we follow the logic of the text, it kills off the well-intended revolution that aimed for equality, as it kills off the beautiful women the protagonists long for, and it transforms them into deceptive spirits that lead them to sin. Interestingly, both Irving and Dumas personify the guillotine, and they do it in a similar way. For both of them, the guillotine is not simply an instrument of violence, it is violence itself, solidified into a cruel agent without mercy, a creature with a mouth that is always hungry for new victims. Now, to cast the guillotine in this role makes a lot of sense when we look at its symbolic significance for the French Revolution and the years that directly followed it. I think it is difficult for someone like me who's never had to live through a situation like that to imagine the omnipresence of these very bloody, close at hand and dramatically staged public executions by guillotine. I think that today institutional violence is often carried out at a distance. Executions happen shielded from the eyes of the public in prisons, and victims of military violence are usually struck down by bombs and drones, again from a distance. Although, of course, this institutionalized violence today is no less real and brutal than a public beheading. And even if photographs and videos of these violent acts quickly travel around the world and draw attention to them, I don't think that someone like me, and maybe also you, who live somewhere relatively safe, somewhere that is not directly threatened or directly affected, I don't think that someone like me can possibly fathom what it is like to live in the midst of officially carried out violence that is not only visible but hyper-visible. This hyper-visibility is something that Dumas describes very well in his story, I think, where he really shows how these executions are a daily spectacle that people flock to. You know, they follow the carts to the Place de la Révolution, they watch the execution, they shout and cheer, even though they are also deeply disturbed by them. And truly, he was not exaggerating. In a chapter from her book, The Man Who Thought He Was Napoleon, the historian Laure Murat writes about the importance of the invention of the guillotine. The guillotine was designed as an efficient instrument of execution, and it was invented with the idea of making executions quick, painless, and impersonal. As I already mentioned, executions by guillotine were big public spectacles, and they were already described at the time when they happened as celebrations of destruction. And these celebrations of destruction really took place daily in Paris. During the year that the Reign of Terror lasted, on average 5 people were beheaded every day. At the beginning, these were members of the royal family, like the king and the queen, aristocrats, high-ranking figures of the royal court, but later on the people who were in danger of being executed really widened. Regular people who were monarchists, so supporters of the monarchy, or anyone really who opposed the new regime, even if they were only against certain parts of it, ran the risk of being executed. And as I already said, these executions didn't take place in a kind of somber environment. Instead, they were spectacular and performative, and this led contemporaries to compare the executions with theatre. On the stage of the guillotine, the leading actor, the executioner Sanson, performed a unique show with every new victim, and people went to see them all the time. Sometimes even the victims of the guillotine carefully prepared for their final performance as a performance. For example, there is a report of an actress who, when she climbed up the steps to the guillotine, she sang a song she had written for her own execution, where she called the scaffold just another stage for her to act on. And here I'd like to paraphrase the politician Camille Desmoulins, who died himself shortly after he wrote this by the guillotine. He wrote that every new play in the theatre of the guillotine is a premiere and a dernier. So this theatre metaphor around the executions was very widespread, and I think it shows very well how institutionalized violence kind of became a form of entertainment. Now, of course, this wasn't the only context in which that happened. You know, there were often big crowds at executions before the French Revolution as well in different European countries, but I think here it kind of takes it to a different level. It's crazy how much these executions were seen as spectacle and entertainment. This spectacle also generated a lot of secondary material, things like drawings and paintings and written reports. To quote from Murat's text, artists took up their places at the foot of a scaffold to capture the expressions on faces faced with death, whose public staging offered the hope that skilled pencils might decipher its mystery. A plethora of engravings were published, endlessly showing the executioner brandishing a bloody head by the hair. Final words were noted down, poses were recorded. There was a deliberate documenting of these acts of violence as sort of pop cultural texts. On the one hand as news texts, but also as, you know, illustrations and kind of artifacts that were created around the executions, right? And this also went into a different direction where there were a lot of popular songs and jokes about the guillotine. For example, the guillotine was referred to as the national razor or the sword of equality, and those who were executed were referred to as having been given the patriotic haircut. So people were clearly fascinated, and there was a darkly humorous and sensationalizing response to the executions that manifested itself in different popular media, which I think does make a lot of sense, given that in traumatic situations or situations that are at least very distressing, people often respond with dark humor, and we see that happening to a great extent during the Reign of Terror. But the paintings, the songs and the jokes were not the only cultural objects to come out of the Reign of Terror's culture of mass executions. Remember Arsene's black velvet necklace that is clasped by a mini silver guillotine? It is not just a nice bit of symbolism or foreshadowing, it is more real than you might think. As the doctor with the diamond skull says to Hoffman about the guillotine clasp, all the fashionable ladies wear at least one. At this point, I have to say I fell down a bit of a rabbit hole. I say as if I wasn't deep down a rabbit hole already, but this is a second, even rabbitier rabbit hole about how the French were completely unhinged during and after the Jacobin Reign of Terror, not only in general, but also regarding fashion and subculture. Because after witnessing execution after execution, some feeling this was the future, others feeling like they might end up on the scaffold next, after all this killing, people on both sides decided, let's make this guillotine business fashion. Laure Murat writes in her chapter about how pro-republican, so pro-revolution women wore jewelry with guillotine motifs like Arsene's clasp. For example, there were guillotine-shaped earrings that commemorate the execution of the king, and these survive to this day. And there will be a picture of them on the Midnight Culture Club Instagram page that you can go look at, or you can also easily find images of these earrings by googling guillotine earrings. The reason why we know for certain that these earrings were pro-republican is because there is a little Jacobin hat that sits at the top of the guillotine, and below it, so below the guillotine, hangs the chopped off head of the king with a little crown on. So the Jacobin hat has taken the uppermost position, at the very top, while the king is dead and discarded at the bottom. I think that's a pretty clear message. At least that's how I read the placement of these symbols. But what is undisputed is that the Jacobin hat at the top is definitely a symbol for the Republic. So these were pro-Republic pieces of jewelry. Now you may think, of course, guillotine jewelry was worn by fans of the revolution. Why would people who like the old regime and whose families were executed by the dozen wear guillotine jewelry, you absolute nut? Well, that sounds like a reasonable thought, but there's one thing fashion during this period wasn't, and it's reasonable. Even though the revolution aimed for equality and a better future, it left behind tens of thousands of people who lost relatives and friends to executions and massacres. There were so many people who grieved for their loved ones, people who were frustrated or enraged by the destructive turn the revolution had taken under the Jacobins, and these people wanted to commemorate their dead loved ones and sometimes demonstrate their frustration with the revolution. And they came up with even more guillotine fashion and surrounding culture than the Republican side ever did. Most information that you can find about the fashion and culture of commemorating and grieving the dead of the revolution appears around description of a type of event known as bal des victimes, or victims' balls. These balls were exclusive events where only victims of the terror, so people who had lost relatives to the guillotine, were granted entry. Because many of the people who had been executed had been aristocracy, or at least very wealthy, their children who danced at the bal des victimes were from an upper class background too, although many had lost much of their fortune. But they were the old elite, so these weren't events for the common people. In general, they are described as glamorous and dramatic affairs with some rather bizarre fashion trends and behaviors. But before we talk about these bizarre details, I want to give a bit of a historical source disclaimer. So, in general, historians agree that the victims' balls did exist, and there are some documents from the end of the Reign of Terror onwards that describe these events. But the majority of the information on them doesn't appear until the 1820s, and it seems that often these texts have a political agenda. They were trying to make the old elite, or the young people that were descended from the old elite, look ridiculous and cruel. On the other hand, there was also often a financial incentive behind it, so they were written by people who we know for sure needed money desperately and tried to write something that would sell. So we don't know if these sources are the most reliable. Interestingly, the 1820s, when these sources appear, is also the period that our first two examples, the Irving story and the Smith story, were published. So perhaps during this period there might have been a specific interest in the morbid and bizarre stories about recent history. Because of this time gap, there are historians who believe that the victims' balls are pure legend and did not actually happen. It is likely that if they existed, there is a bit of exaggeration and sensationalism involved in the descriptions that we do have. So take this information with a grain of salt. According to the sources that we do have, the victims' balls were, on the one hand, events of grieving and mourning, as I said, but on the other hand, they celebrated in a sort of ecstatic way the survival of those who had made it out alive at the other end of the reign of terror. And a lot of the commentary about them had a shocked tone. These events were perceived as morbid and bizarre practices. They were sometimes labelled false performative mourning that served as an excuse for boundless pleasure-seeking and disrespectful behaviour. These reports mention details like how people would greet each other by like a sort of abrupt jerking of the head that was supposed to like mimic the movement of the head when it's cut off by the guillotine. But there were also people who understood these victims' balls as events of survival, of trying to continue after everything was lost. For example, there is a quote by the historians Edmond and Gilles Goncourt that I believe is also from the 19th century, and I took this from the Schechte text that is also linked in the sources, and they wrote about the victims' balls in a way that I think captures the motivation and the atmosphere. And I know this is probably a little bit romanticized, but I think it carries over the idea of what the point of them was very well. Quote, "France is dancing. She dances to avenge, she dances to forget. Between her bloody past and her dark future she dances. Scarcely saved from the guillotine she dances. France, still bloodied and all ruined, turns and pirouettes and spills about in an immense and mad farandole." So all is lost, so you may as well dance madly on the tomb of your own past. There is very little left to lose, and you just have to celebrate your bare life. That's the idea behind it. At the same time, while celebrating bare life itself, the dancers at these balls, like our stories, reanimated their dead. They did it symbolically through their clothing, their hairstyles, and their jewellery. It is reported in many sources that especially the women danced barefoot, and they wore white gowns that resembled the underclothes in which people were usually executed. There were popular hairstyles that mimicked the way that the hair of people who were executed was cut short beforehand so that their necks would be visible and they could be placed better under the blade. But there are also stories of women who cut off their own hair while they were incarcerated and waiting for execution in order to pass it on to their relatives as a token, like as a memorial. The hairstyles that mimicked these practices were either ones where the hair was braided up at the back of the head to reveal the neck, or sometimes it was even cut off at the back of the head, or cut short overall. And these hairstyles were known as coiffure à la victime. Although again, this term only appears a little bit later in the sources, but then it generally takes a while for spoken language terms to enter into the written record, so I don't think that's necessarily evidence that the term wasn't used already in the 1790s. But not only the gowns and the coiffure were à la victime, there was also jewellery. And this will sound familiar to you because especially the women often wore chokers or collars, usually in red, to invoke the bloody cut the guillotine made to the necks of the executed. And allegedly, there were also pieces of jewellery shaped like the guillotine. That sounds like, familiar. That sounds like something we've heard before. Now, this whole look is known as costume des victimes, and the sources for its existence, independent of the victims' balls, are relatively solid. There are paintings and drawings that depict people, again usually women, dressed in the costume des victimes, with the gowns, with the short hair, and with the red necklaces. We see this look highlighted in The Nameless Woman in Irving's story, as well as Arsène at the foot of the guillotine, because they are dressed exactly like this, which makes sense since they are literally victims of the guillotine. They are the inspiration for the look, but it is specifically highlighted that that is how they are dressed, that they're not properly clothed, that their shoulders are bare and their neck is bare, that the velvet choker is plainly visible. And in Arsene's case, we also get the blood dripping from the choker, so that also brings forth this idea of the line of the cut. And she's also then revealed to be barefoot. So Arsène really hits all the markers of the costume des victimes. Now this kind of outfit, this costume des victimes, is associated with a specific counter-revolutionary youth culture. Often the members of this were children of the executed. And we know for certain that this subculture existed because it's in the political record. This subculture is known as the jeunesse dorée, which translates to gilded youth. They were, according to their detractors, young people who were lavish, extravagant, they were flaunting their wealth and living excessively and without care after the end of the Jacobin regime. It was also these critics who came up with the term jeunesse dorée, which invokes the idea of a shiny surface with nothing of value underneath. Just a brief add-on, related to the jeunesse dorée, there was a group of people known as the incroyables and the merveilleuses, and this is mostly a fashion term, so it's not like as political as the jeunesse dorée, but it also referred to a subculture that consisted of people who were supporters of the Ancien Régime, but they were mostly about the fashion and the aesthetic, so their clothes were very, very over the top. The women wore dresses that copied ancient Greek statues. These people deliberately spoke with a pronunciation that had become popular at court when the revolution began, and they were very much made fun of as ridiculously lavish and excessive and superficial and not to be taken seriously. And this subgroup is actually seen as one of the predecessors of dandyism that arose in the 19th century. That might actually take its name from the French word dandin, which means idiot. Little fun fact on the side, but let's go back to the more serious jeunesse dorée and why they are important to the guillotined woman stories. According to an article by Annette Höfer about fashion, class and subcultures during this period, the jeunesse dorée's clothing included an interesting detail that to us in this episode once again will be very familiar. They were black or green velvet collars, referencing, like their red counterparts in the costume des victimes, the cut of the guillotine. And in fact, these velvet collars were so characteristic that the people wearing them were referred to as collet noir or collet vert, black collars or green collars. I think it is astonishing how very close to the black velvet necklace of the women we've encountered so far, and as you'll see in the next episode, the green velvet choker will become central in newer adaptations of the tale. So I just think it's astonishing how close this fashion trend of the jeunesse dorée is to the chokers worn by the women throughout the tradition of these stories. We have the exact same colors and the same fabric and the same placement. I think that is really, really cool. Also, the red choker from the costume des victimes will also appear in one of the stories we're going to talk about next time, so stay tuned. Now, that doesn't mean that we can say for sure that the velvet necklaces of the women in these stories are directly related to the colors of the jeunesse dorée, but I would like to think that they are related. In light of this context, let's think about what the significance of the velvet necklace is in these stories of beheaded women. Now, Solomon interprets Arsene's necklace as solely pro-republic. She was also given it by her boyfriend Danton, who is a revolutionary, but I would argue that the necklace is actually more ambiguous in this context. As we've heard, the guillotine jewellery was worn by supporters of the Republic, but also, according to some reports, were part of the costume des victimes. The placement of Arsene's necklace, that even drips blood at one point, really reflects the red chokers worn by women to commemorate the executed, and the black velvet collars that were integral to the outfits of the jeunesse dorée as a whole. I would also add that the decoration with diamonds that Irving and Dumas give their ladies flaunts wealth and luxury, something that again is associated with counter-revolutionary subcultures and their lavish dress. In my opinion, more points to the guillotined woman in Irving and Dumas being associated with sympathizers of the Ancien Régime or the jeunesse dorée rather than pro-republicanism. Now, as a note, in 1793, when the story is set, the jeunesse dorée isn't around yet, but when the stories were written in the 1820s and 1840s respectively, this subculture had been a thing and had been very visible at its peak of popularity. So it's not absurd to think that fashion of the jeunesse dorée could have been an influence. What remains is, however, an ambiguity about what the guillotined woman's necklace, especially Arsene's necklace, with the guillotine jewelry element and the choker element combined, signifies regarding where she belongs in the structure of society during the revolution. And I think this ambiguity could also convey how easily one could slip from pro-revolution to being considered an enemy of the revolution. How quickly you could fall victim to the guillotine, even though you had been a supporter of the revolution at some point. So eventually, I think the ambiguity of the necklace can be read as a symbol for the slippery slope, for the self-destructiveness of the Reign of Terror that starts killing its own supporters once they step slightly out of line. A symbol for the revolution that eats its own children. If you would like to know more about these historical aspects, definitely check out the sources for this portion that are linked in the description. Some of them are public, some you can try and access with a library account if you have one. Most of them are accessible with library accounts. And they just contain a lot more detail in this cursory overview I'm doing here. They have a lot of quotes from primary sources in them as well. It's very fascinating, so I really recommend that. Alas, we have collected the puzzle pieces of the early wave of stories about women with foreboding necklaces, the details of the plot and the characters, the historical context, the strange cultural phenomena that followed, and now it is time to put them all together for some serious analysis and to build a base for all the developments and shifts in the trope that we'll see in part 2. Fucking helicopters again. Will you stop it? There, I can see it. I can see it. You fuck off right now. Thank you. For this, I want to focus on two elements that all the stories we've encountered so far share. And these two elements are, on the one hand, the connection between resurrection and desire, and on the other hand, the theme of the fragmented body as a source of horror and how this relates to the significance of gender in these stories. So let us begin with a bit of resurrection. So I've mentioned earlier on that the theme of resurrection, the return of the dead, is sort of a classic motif of the Gothic and of the late Romantic literary era, and really it sits at the heart of the ghost story as a genre, because ghosts are essentially the dead that return, whose spirit is resurrected, and in many older ghost stories like this one, so is their body. Resurrection really played a huge part in the time period after the French Revolution. There is an article by Camiletti who writes about how after the Reign of Terror ended, there was a boom of fiction about resurrection and ghost stories. They were very popular. A lot of Gothic writing was imported from England or newly written in French. And there was also a type of show that became popular at the time called the phantasmagoria. And these were events where people attempted to contact their dead and to summon spirits. So this ties in with the commemorative practices of the Bal des Victimes. And in the section about these phantasmagoria, I think Camilletti says something that is very crucial to the fascination with the resurrection in these stories and why it becomes linked with a desire for the resurrected women. Camilletti writes that phantasmagoria shows were the venue where the inexpressible fear of or hope for the return of a dead world could be articulated. So it is this notion of the mutual fear and hope for the return of the past and that which is dead that is expressed through the irresistible but also doomed desire for the guillotined woman. It's a dilemma between fear and desire that can't really be resolved properly. When we think about the fear of and desire for the dead to return, we get a conflict between the past and the present. That's also something I've touched on earlier on, right? We get this oppressive old regime of hundreds of years that has been violently killed off, that cannot be restored, but whose replacement also wasn't stable and it was also overtly destructive. So neither the past nor the present are sufficient. The present is broken, which makes you long for the past, but the past is also broken. And even if it wasn't, it couldn't be returned to with all these horrific things that have happened with the terror regime, with changes in identity and religion, and the way the country is structured. And in the motif of resurrection, this conflict can be played through over and over again. We can bring back the past and realize that it doesn't work and then it falls apart again. Like the head of the woman falls off again after she has come back to life for a bit. And I think through this repetitive going through of this conflict in fiction, in the theme of resurrection, maybe the conflict can be made a little less scary, more controllable. And I believe that it is the question of control over this conflict where the desire of our young male protagonists for the women comes into play. Because both Irving's and Dumas students are mostly attracted to fantasies of these two women. In Irving's story, we have the dream image, and then with Dumas, we have this made-up love story that Hoffmann basically comes up with while dreaming of Arsène. These are made-up futures and unrealistic imaginations of the women and the relationships the men might have with them. Within these imagined worlds, of course, they have control and they can safely desire the women without anything happening. You know, they are literally the women of their dreams. They are exactly how they want them to be. And because at this point they are very imaginary, there can't be a reality that interferes with the dream. But once the students try to transfer these dreams into real life, once they actually meet the women and they are intimate with them, the illusion falls apart. There is one night of passion, in Hoffmann's case heavily aided by a lot of alcohol that helps maintain the dream world for a while, but in the cold light of day that follows, the illusion is exposed as an illusion. The woman who was the pinnacle of beauty and desirability is a cold, pale, dead shell. There is nothing left of the once glorious dream. So the women can be seen as stand-ins for the unrealistic dreams that these young men have of their future, of their success, both in romantic and sexual relationships, and in Hoffmann's case, also financial success, because money plays a big role there as well. And these are two areas that are traditionally sort of seen as important for men to be successful in. And, you know, these young men's dreams about being successful in these areas have a lot to do with wanting to meet societal expectations. So when the dream falls apart, they have failed at fulfilling society's expectations towards them as men. And I think in the context of the French Revolution setting, these young men and their dreams that fail as soon as they come true can also be seen as stand-ins for the new regime that was mostly led by young men with big aspirations, like they are. A regime that chases a dream that quickly turns into a nightmare because of the bloodshed of the terror. Just like the student's dream of winning the beautiful woman turns into a nightmare because of the bloodshed of the terror. This idea of these big dreams that fail has a lot to do with the concept of hubris. Hubris is basically the reckless overestimating of yourself and your abilities that then ends in a tragedy that wouldn't have happened if you hadn't overestimated yourself. It fits very well into the idea of chasing an unrealistic dream and failing at it. And I think it is this hubris in these young men and in the revolutionaries that emerges from these two stories. With this interpretation of the guillotined woman story as a story about illusions and hubris of the young male protagonists, we've touched on the role that gender plays here. And this leads us very nicely into the next theme that is especially important when we look forward to how the story of the woman with the choker went on to develop. And that is the theme of the fragmented body as a source of horror. In Solomon's article, she writes about the gendering of the guillotine as female. The name guillotine is already derived from it's like a feminized version of the name of the man who invented it. And there were also a lot of nicknames for the guillotine that are feminine. Names like la fiancée, so the fiancée, or la veuve, which means the widow. So these are all clearly feminine nicknames. According to Solomon, in this type of story, the guillotine as a feminized presence merges with the guillotined woman. While the guillotine cuts down the woman's body, the guillotined woman cuts down the man's sanity and his ego. So there is a fragmentation through a feminine force, we could say. This links to the concept of the monstrous feminine. And the monstrous feminine is one of my kind of favorite theoretical models for literary analysis. It's really, really cool. It comes from psychoanalytic literary analysis, so it gets a little bit weird, be warned, but it's very interesting. According to this theory, the monstrous feminine refers to women or feminized figures that are violent, deadly, and destructive. In her excellent book about the monstrous feminine, Barbara Creed defines several types of the monstrous feminine. To give you an idea, that can, for example, be the witch, or the female vampire, or the monstrous mother, or the femme castratrice, the woman as a literal or symbolic castrator. Remember that, we'll get back to it. Overall, the construct of the monstrous feminine can be summarized as a female embodiment of anxieties about the ego, the whole complete self. Now, psychoanalytic theory says that the whole complete self is lost to us. We don't have access to our whole person because some parts are subconscious, some parts we have repressed, but we always want to recover the complete self. So that is something that we yearn for but that we can't have. We want to be complete, but we are forced to be incomplete in our personhood, in our knowledge of ourselves. Enter the guillotined woman, who is literally, physically no longer a whole person. She literally embodies and makes visible this inner incompleteness that scares us so much. Now, what's also important is that in psychoanalytic theory, this concept of the complete and the incomplete is very binary gendered. So the incomplete is marked as feminine. So the anxiety of not being a whole, complete being is linked to the feminine because of the lovely concept of castration and castration anxiety that Bestie Freud was a little bit obsessed with. So according to Freud, castration anxiety arises in the child. The child is always a boy in Freud, by the way. So when the child realizes that not everyone has a penis, he assumes that said penis has been cut off, because apparently the boy can't realize that there's not just no penis, but a whole different type of genital. But alas, according to Freud, he doesn't. He just thinks, oh, there's no penis, so this person has been castrated. And from then on, the boy is scared of being castrated. What's very important is that this is not just a fear of being physically hurt, but also a fear of losing your power and your agency that you're granted because you are a man or have the privilege of being considered male in your society. So we have a connection between the whole self, the uncastrated male, and power and agency. I'm quickly going to quote 2 sentences from my MA thesis where I kind of describe this in a way that I think makes sense. This also refers to Barbara Creed, by the way. As Barbara Creed points out, from a psychoanalytic perspective, the lack of a penis is considered shocking because it invokes male fears of castration, in which the body is breached and mutilated. It is for this reason that feminine sexual difference, defined by the lack of penis, is seen as abject and monstrous. What this means is that, according to this psychoanalytic idea, we have the man who is associated with the complete, even though he's not complete, but he's not castrated. So he is considered complete, and the absence of a penis invokes the fear of castration, which is why it is scary. And because of this, the female body that can be interpreted as castrated, or just anybody that doesn't have a penis, is seen as different and other and kind of contrary to the ideal of the whole person that has agency and power. That's as simple as I can make it. Because of this, that means that the fear of castration is above all a fear of being excluded and a fear of being made powerless. If we follow this psychoanalytic approach, this castration anxiety is the fear that the guillotine and the guillotined woman make painfully visible, which is the fear of being made incomplete and powerless by, to say it cruelly, having a part of you chopped off. Not fun. Because the guillotine and the guillotined woman make this fear so visible, that's uncomfortable and it creates horror in the reader. That would be the psychoanalytic explanation for it. And of course, the guillotined woman and the feminized guillotine create a sort of double link between castration anxiety and the feminine that is associated with castrating. On the one hand, we have the guillotined woman, who invokes a fear of castration because she appears castrated, in this case through being beheaded and made incomplete and have her agency taken away. But also, the fear of castration is made visible in the form of the feminized guillotine, which functions as a femme castratrice figure, as a woman as castrator figure, because it is this feminized presence that does the castrating, that chops bits off. So we could attribute the horror in this first wave of women with chokers stories to a fear of being made incomplete, powerless, and other. And if we link this to the interpretation of desiring the resurrected woman as a code for failed dreams and failed ambitions, we could come to a possible sort of preliminary conclusion that these stories, the stories of the guillotined women, are essentially stories about a fear of loss, a fear of failure, and a fear of being powerless. Or maybe it's just scary that a person could come back from the dead. Maybe it's both. It's probably both. Of course, there are many ways in which we could read this type of tale. I just wanted to bring up this interpretation because it works well with where we are heading in part 2. Because in part 2, we are going to look at what I would call the second wave of women with choker stories. Because after Dumas' Femme au collier du velours, the woman with the choker disappears from the literary stage for over a century, to emerge only in the 1970s during the second wave of feminism in a transformed way. In her return in these modern renditions, the gendered aspect we just talked about is really brought to the forefront. In the next episode, we will encounter versions of this story where the perspective has been switched, where the women are the protagonists, the narrators, rather than longed for objects of desire or monstrous embodiments of terror and fear. And as the narrative agency shifts, you'll see that the origins of horror and the source of violence shift as well. That is it for part 1 of this double feature. Again, I'm sorry you had to wait for it for so long, but maybe it makes up for it a little bit that it's really, really bloody long. It's basically 2 episode length, so you've got a lot to listen to, which I hope is a bit of a restoration payment for you. I will let you know when part 2 comes out on the old Instagram, but also make sure you're subscribed to the podcast here on Spotify so you don't miss more women losing their heads or other fun topics like that. As a reminder, I'm not going to stick to the 2-week upload schedule anymore, so episodes will be out at irregular intervals. Maybe sometimes it takes a bit longer, sometimes it takes a bit shorter. There will also be kind of more chatty episodes that are less researched and less scripted. We'll see what happens. But most of all, I want to thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. Be careful should you pass under any scaffolds in the dead of night, and don't swear any oaths you can't keep, but one oath I surely hope you do keep, and that is to stick to the first rule of Midnight Culture Club. Tell everyone about Midnight Culture Club, including any resurrected ladies and emo boys you may know, but also your friends, your aunties, and all your lovely followers on whatever social media it is you use. That would be dead excellent. I'll now go take off my choker and see what happens. If there's no part 2, you know why. And with that, I bid you adieu and hope to see you again soon here on the nocturnal side. Sweet dreams and good night.